Imagine being asked to sacrifice the one thing you've waited your entire life for, the one promise that gave your life meaning. This is exactly what happened to Abraham in one of the most intense and heartbreaking moments recorded in Scripture. Today we're going to uncover why God would ask such a terrible thing from his faithful servant, and what this story reveals about faith, trust, and God's ultimate plan for humanity. The story in Genesis 22 begins with words that should make us pause. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. Right from the start, the Bible tells us this was a test. God already knew what Abraham would do, but Abraham didn't know what he was capable of until he went through this experience. This wasn't about God getting information because God knows everything. This was about Abraham discovering the depth of his own faith and stepping into a level of trust that would define him for all of history. Let me set the stage for you. Abraham had waited 25 years for Isaac to be born. 25 years of hoping, praying, and watching his body and Sarah's body grow old. God had promised him that he would become the father of many nations, and that through his offspring all peoples on earth would be blessed. But year after year passed with no child. Abraham was 75 when God first made the promise, and he was 100 years old when Isaac was finally born. Can you imagine the joy, the relief, and the overwhelming love he must have felt for this miracle child? Isaac wasn't just Abraham's son. He was the walking, breathing proof that God keeps his promises. Every time Abraham looked at Isaac, he saw God's faithfulness made flesh. This boy represented everything Abraham had hoped for and everything God had planned for the future. So when God said, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah and sacrifice him there as a burnt offering," it must have felt like the ground was crumbling beneath Abraham's feet. Before I continue, if you enjoy videos like this, please consider subscribing. I post almost every day to make sure you can uncover and understand the hidden mysteries of the Bible. Subscribing really helps me keep creating these stories for you. Now here's what makes this test so profound. God wasn't asking Abraham to give up something random or meaningless. He was asking him to surrender the very thing through which all of God's promises were supposed to be fulfilled. Think about the thoughts that must have raced through Abraham's mind. How can God's promise come true if Isaac dies? How can nations come from my descendants if my only son is gone? Does this mean God lied to me? Does this mean everything I've believed was wrong? But Abraham did something that reveals the extraordinary nature of his faith. Genesis 22:3 tells us that early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He didn't argue with God. He didn't try to negotiate or bargain. He didn't wait to see if God would change his mind. Early the next morning means Abraham probably couldn't sleep that night yet. When dawn came, he immediately set out to obey. This level of trust is almost incomprehensible when you really think about what was being asked of him. The journey to Mount Moriah took 3 days. Can you imagine those 3 days? Every step bringing Abraham closer to the unthinkable. Every night camping under the stars with Isaac beside him, knowing what the morning would bring. The Bible doesn't tell us what Abraham was thinking during those 3 days, but the book of Hebrews gives us an incredible insight. Hebrews 11:19 says that Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. This means Abraham had worked through the problem in his mind. He knew God had promised that Isaac would father many nations. He also knew that God had commanded him to sacrifice Isaac. Since both of these things came from God, and God cannot lie, Abraham concluded that God must be planning to raise Isaac from the dead after the sacrifice. This wasn't blind faith that ignored reality. This was faith that trusted God's character so deeply that it could accept what seemed impossible. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood. Then he bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Just think about this moment. Isaac was probably a teenager at this point, strong enough to carry the wood up the mountain. He could have resisted or run away, but he submitted to his father's actions. Some scholars believe Isaac understood what was happening and chose to trust his father's faith in God, even when nothing made sense. Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. This is the moment everything hung in the balance. Abraham had passed the test. He had proven that he loved God more than the gift God had given him. He had shown that his faith in God's promises was stronger than his fear of losing everything. And at that exact moment, the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him, because now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." God provided a ram caught in a thicket by its horns, and Abraham sacrificed it instead of Isaac. He named that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." But why did God test Abraham this way? What was the purpose behind such an extreme trial? First, this test revealed what was truly first in Abraham's heart. We all say we love God and trust Him, but do we love Him more than our dreams, our children, our security, and our future? Abraham proved that his loyalty to God was absolute. He was willing to surrender even the promise if God asked him to, because he trusted God's character more than he understood God's plans. This kind of faith became the foundation for everything that would follow in the story of God's people. Second, this test prepared Abraham for his role in salvation history. God was going to make a covenant with Abraham that would bless all nations through his offspring. That covenant required a man whose faith was tested and proven at the deepest possible level. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac foreshadowed what God himself would do thousands of years later when he sent his own son Jesus to that same region to die for the sins of the world. Think about the parallels between Isaac and Jesus. Both were miracle sons promised by God. Both were beloved sons. Both carried the wood for their own sacrifice up a mountain. Both submitted willingly to their father's plan. But there's one crucial difference. When Abraham raised the knife, God provided a substitute. When Jesus hung on the cross, there was no substitute because he was the substitute for us. God stopped Abraham from sacrificing Isaac, but God did not stop the sacrifice of his own son. This is why the location matters so much. Moriah is the region where Jerusalem would later be built. Jewish tradition says the exact spot where Abraham built his altar was the same rock where the temple would stand centuries later. That temple was where countless sacrifices would be offered, pointing forward to the ultimate sacrifice. And just outside Jerusalem, on a hill called Golgotha, Jesus would be crucified as the final and perfect sacrifice for sin. Third, this test demonstrated that true faith requires action. James 2:22 says, "You see that Abraham's faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did." Abraham believed God, but his belief became real faith when he acted on it. We can say we trust God, but our trust is proven genuine when we obey Him, even when it costs us everything we hold dear. Fourth, God was teaching an important lesson about worship. In Abraham's time, the surrounding cultures practiced child sacrifice to their false gods. God was making it absolutely clear that He does not want or accept human sacrifice. He is not like the cruel gods of the pagans. Yes, He tested Abraham to the breaking point, but He provided the substitute. He showed that true worship is about the heart surrender, not about ritual killing. The story also shows us that God's ways are higher than our ways. Abraham couldn't see the full picture. He didn't know that his act of faith would be recorded in Scripture and inspire billions of people for thousands of years. He didn't know that his obedience would make him the father of faith for all who believe. He simply trusted God in the moment, even when everything seemed to contradict God's promises. For us today, this story challenges us to examine where our ultimate trust lies. Do we trust God only when His plans make sense to us? Do we follow Him only when we can see the outcome? Or are we willing to obey even when the path seems impossible and the future looks dark? Abraham's test shows us that real faith continues to trust God, even when circumstances scream that God has abandoned us or made a mistake. Thanks for watching. If this story challenged your understanding of faith, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear about Abraham's incredible trust in God. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into these powerful biblical truths. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore more life-changing stories from Scripture.